Something extraordinary happened last week, and almost nobody noticed. Australia just made a public statement that could reshape how the world works for the next decade. Not in a private meeting, not through diplomatic channels, on national television, in front of their entire country. And what they said changes everything. January 25th, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese appears on national broadcast and makes a statement that reportedly caught many in Washington off guard. 5 simple words: I agree with him. He was referring to Canada's incoming Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And what Carney had said just days earlier wasn't just noteworthy. According to analysts, it was potentially one of the most significant policy speeches by a Western leader in years. Here's what happened. 6 days before Albanese's statement, Carney stood before global leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos and outlined a vision that many experts believe challenges decades of established international relations. According to reports from the forum, Carney argued that the traditional global order, where major powers lead and smaller nations follow, may no longer serve the interests of what he called middle powers. These are countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, and Indonesia. Not superpowers, but not small players either. Nations with significant resources, technology, and educated populations. Carney used a phrase that's now circulating in policy circles worldwide: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. His message, according to analysts who reviewed the speech, was clear. Middle powers need to stop waiting for direction from larger nations and start coordinating with each other. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Reports indicate that President Trump watched that speech and responded the following day in Davos with strong language, stating that Canada depends heavily on the United States for its economic stability. According to sources familiar with the exchange, Trump appeared to suggest that Carney should show more gratitude for the relationship between the two countries. But Carney didn't step back. 4 days later, speaking to reporters in Ottawa, Carney reportedly confirmed, "To be absolutely clear, I meant what I said in Davos." Treasury officials later suggested to media that Carney had softened his position in a private phone call. Carney's team disputed that characterization. And then came the moment that analysts say reveals just how serious this might be. Albanese didn't just praise Carney's speech, he invited him to address the Australian Parliament in March. Parliamentary addresses aren't casual events. According to diplomatic experts, they're reserved for significant figures whose message carries strategic weight. This appears to be more than symbolic. I agree with him, Albanese said on national television, referring specifically to Carney's Davos remarks. Not interesting perspective, not worth considering. According to observers, this was Australia publicly signaling alignment with a new approach to international relations. Now, here's what makes this particularly significant. Documents show that 4 months ago in October, Canada and Australia signed something called the Joint Declaration of Intent on Critical Minerals Cooperation. On the surface, it's about minerals, lithium, rare earths, nickel, graphite, the materials that power everything from electric vehicles to advanced defense systems. But analysts suggest it may represent something more, the foundation of an alternative supply chain that reduces dependence on both China and the United States. Consider the context. Reports indicate that China currently controls approximately 70% of rare earth mining globally and roughly 90% of processing. The United States has reportedly expressed concerns about this dependence, particularly for materials needed in defense and technology sectors. Last October, Australia signed agreements with the U.S. worth billions in critical minerals projects. Administration officials called it a model for supply chain cooperation. But here's what's drawing attention now. Australia appears to have taken that framework and applied the same model to Canada, same structure, same goals, except now, according to policy experts, it's middle powers coordinating with each other, not just responding to Washington's priorities. The minerals agreement reportedly isn't just about trade. According to the text, it includes provisions for joint financing, research, and development of the entire supply chain, from mining to processing to recycling. Why does that matter? Because experts say whoever controls processing controls the supply chain. And right now, that's overwhelmingly China. Sources familiar with the agreement indicate it also includes provisions to set environmental and governance standards for participating companies. Translation, according to trade analysts, Canada and Australia may be creating a partnership where access to their materials requires meeting their standards. Reports suggest over a dozen countries are watching this closely. Mexico's president reportedly praised Carney's message publicly. Officials in South Africa, Indonesia, South Korea, and Brazil are said to be asking similar questions. Can middle powers actually do this? Can they build networks strong enough to reduce pressure from larger powers? Here's the broader context that experts point to. For decades, the international system has generally operated with major powers leading and middle powers following. America leads, allies follow, China dominates, neighbors adapt. The structure, according to international relations scholars, assumed middle powers lacked capacity to act independently, that they couldn't coordinate effectively without direction from larger nations. Carney's Davos speech appears to challenge that assumption directly. According to analysts who reviewed his remarks, he laid out a vision where middle powers don't wait for direction. They set their own agenda, they coordinate collectively, they build alternative partnerships, and Australia's response suggests they're the first to publicly commit to exploring that vision. Let me show you the timeline that's emerging. October 30th, Canada and Australia signed the critical minerals deal in Toronto, not at a G7 summit, not in Washington, at a bilateral meeting between two resource-rich nations. January 19th, Carney delivers the Davos speech outlining his middle power vision. January 20th, Trump responds with strong criticism, according to multiple media reports. January 23rd, Carney reaffirms his position publicly. January 25th, Albanese says, "I agree with him" on national television and extends the parliamentary invitation. Political analysts suggest this appears coordinated. The minerals deal created the foundation. The Davos speech created the framework. Albanese's invitation created the public commitment. According to reports, Trump's response has included threats of significant tariffs on Canadian goods and public criticism questioning Canadian sovereignty. But observers note this may have an unintended effect. Every time pressure increases, it appears to validate Carney's argument that middle powers need alternatives to dependence on any single larger power. Sources indicate Carney has outlined plans for 12 new trade agreements across multiple continents in the coming months, with a stated goal of significantly increasing Canada's non-U.S. exports. Now, here's the critical question. Can they actually deliver? Speeches are one thing. Building functioning international frameworks is something else entirely. Experts point to several major challenges. First, the economics. Building alternative rare earth processing capacity takes years and billions in investment. It requires facilities, technology, skilled workers, and customers willing to potentially pay more for materials meeting higher standards. Documents show both countries are using public financing to support this, but whether it's enough and fast enough remains to be seen. Second, political sustainability. Elections happen, governments change. What happens if future leadership in either country prioritizes different relationships? Reports suggest Trump's pressure may be designed partly to create domestic political costs for Carney, to make the approach appear risky to Canadian voters. Third, expanding the coalition. Canada and Australia are natural partners with similar values and complementary resources. But bringing in countries like Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, or South Korea, each with different priorities and constraints, is significantly more complex. Some countries are reportedly interested but cautious. They want to see results before publicly committing. Here's what observers are watching for. March 2026. Carney addresses the Australian Parliament. Does he announce new agreements, new partner countries, specific institutional structures? If he arrives with concrete results, signed deals, committed funding, partner nations, momentum could build. If it's primarily rhetoric, interest may fade. The other key factor, How does the United States respond going forward? Experts note that increased pressure could backfire by pushing more middle powers toward alternatives, but strategic engagement could potentially address concerns and reduce incentives for alternative frameworks. According to international relations scholars, we may be witnessing one of two scenarios. Either this is the early stage of a significant shift in how middle powers engage with global politics, a moment historians might look back on as pivotal, or it's a statement that generates attention but doesn't translate into lasting institutional change. The next 6 months will likely tell us which. By summer, reports suggest we'll know whether the minerals framework is delivering investment, whether promised trade deals are materializing, whether other middle powers are joining, and whether this vision can survive its first major test. So what do you think? Does Australia's public support for Canada signal something genuinely new in international relations? Or will this fade when faced with the realities of great power politics? I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective.